morning, God, we are so excited to worship you today, whether in person or online. We are starting our service with music, so I invite you to stand and worship this song. As we come into your presence, we remember every blessing that you poured out so freely from above. Lifting gratitude and praises for compassion so amazing. For we come to give you thanks for all you've done. Because of your love, we're forgiven. Because of your love, hearts are clean. We lift you up, the song of freedom, forever wishing. Because of your love. Because of your love, we're forgiven. Because of your love, hearts are clean. We lift you up, the song of freedom, forever wishing. Because of your love. Because of your love, we're forgiven. Because of your love, hearts are clean. We lift you up with songs of freedom, forever we're changed. Because of your love. Please remain standing as we continue to worship through the reading of the word.
We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in the wealth of generosity on their part. I can testify that according to their ability and even beyond their ability of their own accord, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints, and not just as we had hoped. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then to us by God's will. So we urged Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also complete among you this act of grace. Now as you excel in everything, in faith, speech, knowledge, and in diligence, and in your love for us, excel also in the act of grace. I am not saying this as a command, rather by means of the diligence of others. I am testifying the genuineness of your love. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter I am giving you advice, because it is profitable for you who began last year not only to do something, but also to want to do it. Now also finish the task, so that just as there was an eager desire, there may also be a completion, according to what you have. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. It is not that there
some larger sections of it, so it'll be a bit of a survey in these last chapters, but our desire, our goal is to see what God might have to say to us, the church, in 2020 through Paul's writing to the church in the first century. And so, with that said, we dig in. Paul is writing to the church at Corinth. He's probably actually writing from Macedonia. It's important because he looks around him and sees something. So, as it says here in verse 1, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. I can testify that according to their ability and even beyond their ability, of their own accord, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints. And not just as we had hoped. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord, then to us by God's will. So we urge Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also now complete among you this act of grace. And so the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Corinth from Macedonia and wants to remind them about generosity. He wants to remind them specifically they're doing a collection for the folks who are in poverty back in Jerusalem. They are doing a collection for the part of the church that is Jewish by ethnicity. Remember that Christianity at its beginning is a wholly Jewish religion, that Jesus himself is a Jewish man, that Jesus came and claimed to be the fulfillment of the Hebrew scriptures, that all of the early disciples were Jewish as to their ethnicity. But Paul has been called to bring the good news or the gospel of Jesus Christ to people who are not Jewish, and this causes some friction because they're looking at it and going, well, what's with those Gentiles? They do things culturally different. They do things way different than us. They've been involved in this false religion or that false religion. We don't know if we can trust them. And so Paul, as the minister sent by God predominantly to Gentiles, still has on his heart the church back in Jerusalem. And one of the things he's trying to do is help the Gentile churches give generously to those who are in poverty back in Jerusalem to demonstrate that the Gentiles have indeed come into the church of Jesus Christ, and they care also for the people back in Jerusalem, or they care for the Jewish folk in the church. And so he is doing a collection for those in poverty back in Jerusalem. He has been doing this as he goes from place to place. Remember, Paul is essentially a traveling missionary. He goes on missionary journeys. He stops in places, plants churches, starts congregations, and then he moves on as a missionary to the next one. In each of these places, he would collect an offering for the church in Jerusalem so that those in poverty back in Jerusalem would not have to be overwhelmed by that poverty. And so that's what he's writing to the church at Corinth about. He's reminding them of that offering. But he says this, he says, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. Macedonia is a Gentile church, or a church made up of Gentiles, so it's also an impoverished church. They do not have a lot. They do not have a lot in their pockets. They don't have a lot for themselves, and they don't have a lot to give. And yet Paul is going to lift them up as an example of giving. We want to say here to you first, I'll give this to you by way of title or perhaps thesis statement. We are going to argue to you that giving is grace. Giving is grace. I will explain that in a minute, but the theme of our message today will be giving is grace. And we're going to acknowledge then, of course, this reality that grace is desirable. We know this to be true. In the basic Christian sense, any of us who would sit here this morning and claim to be followers of Jesus would say the only reason we are followers of Jesus is because Jesus came and poured his grace out on us. Which is to say that all of us were born into a situation where we were enemies of God, we were enemies of of Jesus Christ. We were enemies of that which is right. And if any of us are now followers of Jesus, it is not because of something we have done. It's not because we earned it. It's not because we worked our way up to it. It's not because we passed various levels and finally achieved it, but rather grace was given to us in Jesus, which rescued us from our sins. Grace, I suppose in a dictionary sense, the dictionary sense I hear regularly is that grace is unmerited favor. I feel like that's a definition that needs another definition. Grace is getting what we do, both what we do not deserve. No, I'll say it this way. Grace is getting that which we do not deserve. Because of God's mercy, he does not then also give us what we do deserve. So we are here as a community of grace. We are here as a people of grace. We sit here. If you're new with us this morning, you will note that Crosswinds is not super showy. We're not putting on any sort of showiness, airs, that sort of thing to say, look at us, we've got it all together. We would confess openly that we do not have it together. We are just kind of a family of worshipers who worship together. What unites us is this, is that we are followers of Jesus because he rescued us. We are followers of Jesus because he chose us. We are followers of Jesus because he called us. We're followers of Jesus because he gave his grace that we did not deserve to us, and he withheld the punishment that we did deserve from us. So, knowing this, that grace is grace, I would say to you, grace is always desirable. Grace is the means by which you get that which you do not deserve. And because of grace, you also do not get what you do deserve. And so grace is desirable, not just in the larger medicine of the story of the world, which is that Jesus came to give us grace, but also in the smaller sense, you know that everyday acts of grace are good. When you're speeding, get pulled over and don't receive a ticket, and you're shown grace, that is good. When you do something dumb in your relationship and that person does not hold it against you, that is good. When you mess up badly at your job, and you should be at least reprimanded, maybe fired, and that doesn't happen, those are definitions of grace manifesting in mercy. All of those things are good. And so I want to say to you first that grace is desirable, so that you understand that if giving is grace and grace is desirable, we should all desire to give. And that's where we'll head this morning. Let me give to you then the example from Macedonia. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. Again, churches in poverty. During their severe trial, brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overwhelmed in a wealth of generosity on their part. The church of Macedonia had joy. We don't know how they had joy. It was kind of strange that they had joy, because they were afflicted. They were affected by their own poverty. They were affected by the situation that was going on around them. They were affected not just like, it doesn't say, now the Macedonians, they had a few issues going on. It was no big deal, but they still found a way to give. It says, we want you to know about the church of Macedonia during a severe trial brought about by affliction. They're in the midst of a severe trial. Things are not going well for them. And it was brought about by affliction. What happened? Their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity. So Macedonia had joy in affliction. Most of us do not look forward to having joy in affliction. Most of us do not relate to joy in affliction. None of us would pray for joy in affliction unless we are already in the affliction, which I mean to say is not any of us are looking to be afflicted. And yet in this life there is a reality that we do live in a broken world, that we do live in a world marred by sin. We do live in a world where everything is kind of messed up. So affliction is part of our human reality often. Most of us would use the term bad day. Most of us use the term things are not going well. Affliction is a very intense word. I think most of us pray that we would never get to the place of true affliction, and yet the human reality, because of the reality of the brokenness of our world, is that affliction might come to us. When affliction came to the church of Macedonia in the form of a severe trial, how did they respond? They had joy in the midst of it. I don't know how to explain that to you other than to say that Jesus was enough for the church at Macedonia. That is what is going to become clear. And they had joy in the midst of trial. They had joy in the midst of brokenness. They had joy in the midst of sorrow. They had joy when everything was going against them and everyone was going against them. The result was they had joy in affliction, but in the midst of going through that affliction, overwhelming generosity wells up in them. I don't know if you've ever met this person. I don't know if you've ever encountered that person who in the midst of going through the worst things in their life manages to still care about what's going on in your life. We find that to be a rare person, but when we encounter that person, we all intuitively know, wow, this is an amazing thing that this person is doing. This is an amazing happening because this person is going through so much struggle and they still find a way to care about me. That's what's going on with Macedonia. They're in a terrible affliction, but that affliction still results in an overflowing generosity. One of the things I remember reading once, I was reading a book about Bob Lupton, who was talking about his neighborhood in Atlanta. Bob Lupton worked with people in extreme poverty, and he said the most amazing thing that he ever saw was that though everybody was struggling with poverty, when one person struggling with poverty saw another person in his community struggling with poverty, they would reach out to them and they would give to them as much as they could give. And we see this regularly. There's this idea that to be generous or to be giving or to be or to take care of someone's needs, that you have to be wealthy. But that is not necessarily true, and it is not even a one-to-one correlation. We know through studies that those who make the least and those who make the way most are the people who give the most, to various causes. But the people who are above poverty and the people who are just kind of rich and really rich, those people, the people above poverty, so the middle class all the way up, they don't really give that much. And so it's an odd thing that studies will show you that the people who have the highest amount of poverty are also often the greatest givers. There is something about having experienced poverty. There's something about looking poverty face to face. There's something about that makes a person, because they're aware of their own poverty, that makes them willing to give to try and help people out of their poverty. So the church in Macedonia, they have joy in the midst of affliction. What happens is overflowing generosity. Due to a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity. May we be the sort of people who would say, again, we don't long for affliction. We also don't long for extreme poverty. But if we could be the kind of person for whom a wealth of generosity overflowed, that would be a wonderful and amazing thing. And you say, well, maybe I don't want to be generous. What's so good about being generous? I will direct you to what I told you at the beginning, that we are going to soon make the argument that giving is grace. And we have already established that grace is desirable. And for the Macedonian church, their giving was a form of grace, both to the people they gave to, but it was a form of grace for them. And so then, their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. I can testify that according to their ability, and even beyond their own ability, of their own accord, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints. It is interesting that in American culture, and also in Paul's culture, because he's writing to the church at Corinth, that some people have to, and a lot of us, myself included, we have to hear messages, and we have to hear encouragement. We have to see it in Scripture. We have to be regularly reminded that we ought be generous. We ought be givers, that we ought want to participate in this. It is interesting that we have to be reminded of this, and sometimes the way in which we hear that is we hear that we should be generous, and then we're like, oh great, I gotta be generous. And then we become sort of the Eeyore of giving. If you don't know Eeyore is the donkey on Winnie the Pooh. Nothing ever goes right for that donkey, and he regularly says, oh my, I guess we ought. He's just never happy. And some of us approach our Christianity in general, but our giving and generosity specifically, as though we were Eeyore. Oh my, I guess I ought give. Except we're forgetting that the place from which giving comes and what giving is grace. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute, but the Macedonian church understood this so well that instead of being Eeyores, they're kind of like Tigers. If you don't know Tigger's the tiger in that, and he's always happy about everything, and he's always bouncing, and he's always excited. Well, the Macedonian church, even though they're overwhelmed with poverty, even though they're overwhelmed with affliction, even though they're in the midst of all that, they're like Tigers. They're like, let us give, can we please give, let us give, let us participate. Let us be a part of it. I will tell you, I will confess to you openly, I have never, as a pastor or as a person who was in ministry before that, either in my own life or in the lives of others, experienced anyone who was begging to be involved with giving. And here is the Macedonian church. Let us give. Let us be involved. So they beg to give. I can testify that according to their ability and even beyond their ability, even of their own accord, they begged earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints. And not just as we had hoped, instead they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. So the Macedonians have joy in affliction, they have overflowing generosity, they beg to be involved, but they give themselves first to the Lord, and having given themselves to the Lord, they say, well, I've given myself to the Lord. If he has everything that is me, I can now give to my brothers. Not only did they have joy in affliction, overflowing generosity, not only did they beg, let us give. Because they'd given themselves to the Lord, it made it easier to give than to their brothers. And then we read this. Verse 5, and not just as we had hoped, instead they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. Verse 6, so we urge Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also complete among you this act of grace. What's happened is Paul's writing to the church at Corinth from Macedonia. He's looking around at the church in Macedonia, and he realizes that this church, in the midst of their trial, in the midst of their extreme poverty, in the midst of everything that they've gone through, is the perfect example of generosity. And he's going to use them to nudge the church at Corinth towards wanting what the church at Macedonia had. So he reminds them, so he urged Titus that just as he had begun, he should also complete among you this act of grace. What had happened was they had started to collect for the brothers in poverty in Jerusalem, and it had tailed off. The church at Corinth, either because of the people who were coming in and coming against Paul's ministry, or other reasons, the church at Corinth has tailed off in its giving. It's not giving as it should. And so Paul lifts up the Macedonian example and says, look at them. They had joy in affliction. They had overflowing generosity. They begged to give. They gave themselves to the Lord, then to the brothers. This example should nudge you towards that church at Corinth. The church at Corinth, which is a wealthier church than the church at Macedonia, he says, you should complete this act of grace among you. So that's the Macedonian example. The question that becomes, so why or how are these Macedonians so generous, and how can we understand their generosity? How does it make sense? And that would have been the question, I think, that the church at Corinth would have asked. So what's up with those Macedonians? Why do they excel in giving, and how is it grace? And so, first off, why are the Macedonians so generous? First off, they realize that grace from God is more valuable than gold. The Macedonians are willing to give what they have in their pocket. It says they begged from extreme poverty. They gave as they were able. In fact, they gave even more than they were able. They just gave. They basically gave everything. Why did they do that? Well, the Macedonian church, because of its trial, because of its extreme poverty, because it's not rich, has probably not had the chance to confuse the gold in its pocket as more important than the grace of God. And it's one of the things that sometimes happens to those of us who have much, even if what we have is much for us, not much compared to others. But sometimes what happens is when you have things, you start to depend upon those things. You start to lean upon those things. You start to trust in those things, right? You're like, well, I don't have a lot, but I've got this, and that becomes your thing. And it could be anything from your shoe collection to your car to your house to your ability to purchase food, any of those sorts of things. When you have things and you feel like you can take care of your own needs, sometimes in taking care of your own needs, you don't realize that you genuinely need God to take care of your needs. And you don't realize that even though you think you're taking care of your own needs, everything you're using to take care of those needs is in itself a grace from God, right? Because if God should choose, you will be healthy, wealthy, and then live long. But if God should choose otherwise, you might have nothing. You might not have, as they say, two pennies to rub together. Your health might fail you. Struggle might come upon you. Affliction might be in your life. Why? If you are not at this moment going through affliction, I say to you, that is grace from God. If you have at this moment a few pennies in your bank account, I say to you, that is grace from God. If you can leave here today and you ask yourself this question, what will we eat? And it's a genuine choice. That is grace from God. Because there are people who have no bank account. There are people who have nothing. There are people who are walking through affliction, and in fact, they will go this afternoon and they will not ask themselves what they will have to eat because they have only one choice. It's the last thing in the refrigerator. That's what they're going to eat. And if you have choice, if you have bank accounts, if you got here somehow in a car that you drove, for instance, filled with gas that you purchased, for instance, you need to realize that gas did not spontaneously place itself into your gas tank. That would be nice if cars did that, but that's not what happens. You went to the gas station and you filled it up with gas, and you purchased that with money that came from your bank account that was put there by your employer that you received for working, and you say, well, I work for the money, so I have money, and I say to you, you're healthy enough to work, and you have a job. And both of those things, again, are grace from God. And so I want you to start to realize, look at your life and understand that everything in your life is a grace from God because it gets us to where we need to go. I remember long ago, and I've told you this story before, but it bears repeating. I remember long ago my children were having a fight with each other, and I was trying to mediate the fight, and one of them said, that's not fair, and the other one said one of the most theologically true things ever said. He said to her, you don't want fair, because if you got fair, you'd be in hell with the rest of the bad guys. He was young, he doesn't still talk like that. Right? Like, we are like, I want fair. I want what I earned. You've earned nothing. And fair is your destruction. Fair is the reality that you were born a sinner, that you grew up a sinner, you moved on through life as a sinner, and at every point in that journey, you were an enemy of the living God. You did not desire him. You did not want him. You did not seek him. You did not chase him. You were his enemy. And he wanted you. He sought you, he chased you, and he got you. And what he gave you when he found you was something that you didn't think you wanted. He gave you himself. And when you received him, it opened up everything for you. But I want you to know that the next breath you take is a result of grace, not anything that you have earned. The next step that you take is a result of grace, not anything that you have earned. You might be here and not even know the Lord Jesus Christ yet, and I would say this to you, you have also received an amazing amount of grace. The Lord himself has graced you with a common form of grace that allows you to be here and in this place and in this minute. And the reason that he has done that is our prayer is so that you might know him, that you might see him, that you might glorify him, that you might glory in him, and you might receive joy from him. But hear me when I say this, everything that you have is grace. The Macedonians realized this, and the reason they realized this, they didn't have much. And when you take everything away and you keep stripping everything away, they had affliction. They didn't have money. They had trial. They didn't have large houses. They had overwhelming poverty. They didn't have growing bank accounts. When they had nothing, they realized that they had nothing, but the grace of God was still sufficient. That the grace of God was still good enough. That the grace of God was still amazing enough. That the grace of God was still wonderful enough. That the grace of God, we can take out all the superlatives and just say the grace of God is enough. The grace of God is what matters. And so the Macedonians are able to be generous because they realize that grace from God is more valuable than gold. I wonder how much we realize that. I wonder how many of us, I said to you, I'm going to give you $1 million or an acute, keen awareness of the grace of God today. That would be an interesting test for all of us that I don't think any of us want to be really honest about how we might pass that. But the Macedonians get it. They realize that the grace of God is more valuable than gold. Well, you go, well, those are Macedonians living back when, and this time, that place, they went through that, and you don't want to believe it for you. And I guess my prayer for you is that God would teach it to you. It was extreme poverty and trial that taught it to the Macedonians, though. So I would try and learn it the easiest way possible, if I were you. The grace from God is more valuable than gold. Giving His grace. The Macedonians, see, when they had nothing, they realized in their own poverty this truth from the Beatitude in the book of Matthew. Blessed are the poor in spirit. We preached the Beatitudes to you several times, so we've been through this. We've done it both from Matthew and from Luke. They both appear there. But the blessed are the poor in spirit. In Matthew, one of the best ways to interpret that, or the best ways to translate that, is blessed are those who, when they come to God, realize they bring nothing to the table. Some of us have an idea that we're in a partnership with God, right? You see this in license plates sometimes, not as much anymore. I don't feel like we're in the halcyon days of license plates, right? Like this is not that moment where, but when I was growing up, license plates, big deal. People would put license plates on their car, and they'd say stuff, and one of those we see is the one that says, God is my co-pilot. Here's the thing. Should you ever get on an airplane called life, I'm pretty sure that you want God to just be the pilot. You don't want to share duties with God, because God will get you where you need to go. And God is going to fly the plane of your life exactly right. But the idea that you are in perfect partnership with Him and you are working together to fly the plane of your life is absolutely incorrect. Because God is trying to get you someplace safely. And what has happened to you and I, by virtue of being born sinners, by virtue of our own brokenness, by virtue of our humanity, which is marred by sin, we are sitting in the plane and trying to steer it into the ground. And the only thing saving us is that God is graceful to us. But let us not treat our relationship with God like some partnership that we've worked out well. You know, it's just me and God. I watched a boxing match last night. It was an interesting boxing match. In this sense, I watched the pre-boxing interview where the man had to be bleeped out about 15 times in a 1-minute interview to explain how he was going to kill the other person in the boxing match, and how he couldn't stand him, and how he hated them. But it was very interesting that after the match, they said, what do you want to say about this amazing victory? It was an amazing victory. He wasn't supposed to win. Nobody expected him to win. It's a major upset. Turns the boxing world upside down. Here's your moment. What do you want to say? He says, first of all, I just want to thank God, because without Him, I wouldn't be here. Which is true, but not in the way he thinks. Right? It's just interesting that a person can go from, I hate that dude, I'm going to kill him, bleepity bleep, 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 that bleep, 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 kill him, to, I just want to thank God, right? This is a guy who thinks he's in a partnership with God. It's not even that. He doesn't view himself as in partnership with God. He views God as a concierge who carries his bags and carries his suitcase and takes care of the things he needs. I want you to hear this. God doesn't work for you. God does not work for you. God is not partners with you. God does not need anything from you. There is not a thing that you have added to God. There's not a thing you could do to make God's day better. There's not a thing that you could do to make God more efficient. There's not a thing that you could do, right, to help God be God. He's God, you're not. He's good, you're not. He's wonderful, we're not. That's reality. You don't have anything that God needs. The Macedonians realized this. You're thinking, well, that's really bad news. No, it's really good news, right? Because the reality is this, is that the Macedonians realized when they came to the table, they didn't bring anything. So if we think in terms of negotiations, we think in terms of sitting down with someone, we think in terms of going to dinner at somebody's house, right? You need to understand that the Macedonians realized when they came in, when they sat down for dinner with God, when they came into their meeting with God, they realized they brought nothing to the table. In a negotiation, you come in, I say, I've got this much money. You say, I've got this much product. I say, I'll give you this much for that. You say, no, you give me this much. We negotiate because we both brought something to the table. Yet in our spiritual lives, the Beatitude says this, blessed is the poor in spirit, and it means this, when you come into the table with God, you bring nothing. I have good news for you, though. I don't want to leave you in that. Here's what the Macedonians realized. They brought nothing to the table, and when they got to the table, they realized that they needn't bring anything. The table was full. When they came and they showed up, they came to the table, they showed up, God had invited them to dinner, they realized they had not a thing in the refrigerator to bring. They had not a thing in their cupboard to make. They had nothing. They showed up meekly at the door when God opened the door and said, come sit at the table. The table was not empty. The table was full. The table was overflowing. The table had food. The table had dessert. The table had the best meats. The table had the best desserts. The table was overflowing. The table is full. They didn't bring anything. The good news is they didn't have to. The table's full. God doesn't need us to bring it. So the Macedonians can be so generous because they realize that they're sitting at the table of the living God, feasting from the food that He's provided, and they brought none of it. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who, when they come to God's table, realize they didn't bring a thing. So then, when the Macedonians realize that they have nothing to bring, and yet have everything, what they realize is that there is a source. What they realize is that Christ Himself is the source and the content of our giving. Listen to what I said. Jesus Himself, we're talking about generosity. Jesus Himself is both the source and the content of everything you give. Right? He's the source. You didn't bring anything to the table. You didn't fix dinner. You didn't barbecue. You didn't cook. You didn't lay out the desserts. You did none of that. God, through Jesus Christ, filled the table. So that anything you have, both spiritually and materially, you need to realize you didn't put it there. God did. And when we realize that Christ Himself put it there, then we realize two things. That Christ Himself is both the source of what we have, but He's also the content of what we have. Right? So that when you sit down to a wonderful meal, and that meal is just amazing, just a random opinion. I think that the best restaurant in Grand Rapids right now is a place called the Butcher's Union. And if you go to the Butcher's Union, what the Butcher's Union serves is steak. And to be in my greatest restaurant, you have to serve steak. So there's some bias there, right? But it serves steak, and it's absolutely the best steak place in Grand Rapids. And if you sit down at the table at the Butcher's Union and you cut into the steak, it is just perfect. And it's like it melts in your mouth, right? Talking about it, I'm like, well, this is going to transition into a message on worship, because when I eat this steak, it's like I know the goodness of God. You know, it's like it is not possible that God would not be good and that this steak would also exist. That steak proves it. And so I say that to say this. It's like when you when you realize that Christ is the content, like he's the goodness, that he's the filler of the table, it just becomes overwhelming. You become so filled with him that he becomes the content of everything you have and everything that you enjoy. We need to realize that everything that's on the table before us, spiritually, metaphorically, and physically, it's Christ himself. He's placed it there. He's the source, but if he's the source, he's also the content of everything, right? So Jesus himself gives us everything we have. It comes through him, and everything we give is from him. He's both the source and the content of what we give. It changes everything. Sometimes we want to think of ourselves as giving. We want to think of it reductionistically, just like, well, I gave that $5, or I gave $20 to I gave $20 to that group, or I gave this. And we want to think of it in terms of money, but we need to reorient our thinking to understand that everything we give, money is just the sort of the placeholder. It's actually Christ which we give. It's Christ which we're extending. It's Christ who gets given in the midst of our generosity. I heard this week a song that's being released. It's actually from a Christmas album that's going to be released. It was written by Lisa Chow and Bob Coughlin. And it had an interesting name. That's what drew me in. So you know that we have a Christmas song called "O Come All Ye Faithful." And I saw this one, and it was called "O Come All Ye Unfaithful." And I went, well, that's an interesting. So I had to go look up the name, and I went, well, that's kind of what we're trying to say here. And I'd just like to read you a few of the lyrics. It says, "Oh come," the song's called "O Come All Ye Unfaithful." It said, "He's the Lamb who is given, slain for our pardon. His promise is peace for those who believe. He's the Lamb who is given, slain for our pardon. His promise is peace for those who believe. So come, though you have nothing. Come, he is the offering. Come and see what God has done." I want to repeat that last part to you. So come, though you have nothing. That's the Macedonian church. They're like, we don't have anything. Like, we're in the midst of severe trial. We're in the midst of extreme poverty. We don't have anything. But they weren't like, oh, depressed or destroyed, because in the midst of realizing that they didn't have anything materially, they realized that in Christ Jesus they had everything that there was to have. And I want to call you to the same place. I want you to call you to come, though you have nothing. So some of you might be, well, I got money in the bank. I've got cash. Some of you might be feeling, I don't think anybody here is feeling like super rich this morning, but you might be feeling solidly upper middle class or middle class, and that's a pretty good place to be in around here, right? And so you might think, well, I've got something. Look at me. I want to tell you this. If you don't have Christ in the right place, if you don't have your affections rightly oriented towards Jesus Christ, if you don't realize that Jesus Christ is the source and content of everything that you do have, you actually have nothing. And it doesn't matter how much you have. You could gain $1 million. You could gain $2 million. You could gain $1 billion. You could be like the Amazon guy who over the period of this COVID has doubled his worth to like multiple billions. He's the first like 200 billionaire. Right? And you could have 200 billion and go, well, that guy's got everything. No, we've heard about that guy. I want to tell you something. He's got nothing. His life bears it out. That dude has nothing. He's just got money. And the Macedonians realized that God was worth more than money. That Christ is worth more than gold. That Christ is both the source and the content. And so I say to you this. Come to Christ, though you have nothing. Come, he is the offering. He's the offering given to the Father to make it so that you might approach the King of glory. He's the offering given to the Father so that God himself wants to be friends with you. He's the offering given to the Father so that the Father looks at you and does not see the wrong that you've done, but the righteousness that Christ has done, and God calls you both friend and child. That's what Jesus Christ has given. So you can come though you have nothing. Come. He is the offering given to God. But then he also becomes the offering that you can give to others. Because he becomes the source and the content of everything you give. Come to see what your God has done. Giving is grace, guys. We know this because if you know Jesus, we are giving what we did not earn and do not deserve. Your ability to wake up any morning and give to someone who has less than you was given to you not by fate. It wasn't given to you by some randomness in life. It wasn't the fact that you woke up, the fact that you have the ability to give, that is God's grace. And so giving is grace. We are giving that which we did not earn and do not deserve. Generosity for the Christian is like buying an extravagant gift with somebody else's money. If you're a parent and your spouse has ever had a birthday, you can relate to this because your child will want to buy birthday presents for your spouse. And they will buy birthday presents, and they will wrap birthday presents, and they will present birthday presents, and they will be excited. If you have enough kids, they might fight over who gets to give their birthday present first, because they're so excited about the birthday present. And they get the birthday present, and then, like, sometimes, again, if you have enough kids, they'll argue over whose present was best. Whose present did Dad like more? My present was the best. Dad liked mine the most. He didn't like yours that much. Dad's never liked you. There are fights. You have enough kids, stuff goes down. It gets wild in there, right? It's a rough world out there. But here's the thing. In my family, this happens all the time. The reality is those presents were bought with my wife's money. My kids didn't earn that money. If they earn money, they put that someplace to buy stuff that they want, right? And they'll say, I've got this much money in the bank. I can get this. And they buy for themselves. But I know there's a reality. On my birthday, my wife is paying for those gifts. So, just as a technical point, we being married, sharing the same bank account, I bought those birthday gifts for myself, if we're being honest about it. They better do well with my money. That's what it's like, right? Because generosity is the means by which we give to the church, we give to others, we give to the poor. Generosity is a lifestyle that we live, but it's buying extravagant gifts from other people with somebody else's money. Ultimately, as an act of worship to God. So when we give to others, we're ultimately giving to God, but all we're giving to God is from what He's given us with His own money. We are buying presents for our daddy with our daddy's money every time we're generous. It's an extravagant gift bought with somebody else's money. When grace is understood, it should overflow. Let me just show to you quickly. Verse 7. Now you excel in everything, in faith, speech, knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love for us. Excel also in this act of grace. I'm not saying this as a command, rather by means of the diligence of others, I'm testing the genuineness of your love. For you know that through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though He was rich, for your sake He became poor, so that by His poverty you might become rich. And in this manner I am giving you advice, because it is profitable for you, who began last year not only to do something, but also to want to do it. Right? Let's talk marriage just briefly, 1 minute. I don't know how deep you're into your marriage. I'm like 25 years in. But early, I remember this fight when it regularly happened. She would say, why didn't you bring out the trash? And I would say, I didn't remember the trash. Didn't even think about it. Didn't know it was trash day. It never came up. And she would say, how can you not remember that it's trash day? And I would say, I'll be honest with you, trash day, just not that important to me. Didn't remember. To which she would say, but it's important to me. To which I'd say, well, okay, well, remind me. And then she would say, if you really love me, you'd remember. Which is a weird thing to say about trash. But I think what she was saying was this. So I don't want you to bring the trash out just because you feel some sort of obligation. Like some sort of, you have to do this. Because we know in a relationship that doing things out of obligation is not, what she was saying is, I want you to love me so much that you remember the things that are important to me. That you remember the things that matter to me. And it wasn't that trash was the most important thing. It was that she wanted to be remembered and she wanted me to want to. That's what Paul's saying here. He's like, guys, I'm not trying to guilt you into giving. I'm not trying to scare you into giving. I'm not trying to say any of that. I just want you to want to give. And the way that we learn to want to give is we understand everything we have comes from a good God who gave everything to us. There's nothing in your life or in your pocket or in your purse that you put there. That was all put there by the overflowing grace of a good God. And when you realize the overflowing nature of his grace to you, your generosity should overflow to others. You should want to give. So I challenge you with that. How deep is the grace of God in your life? And is it making you want to be as generous as you possibly can? That's what Christ in your life should be doing. Pray with me. Jesus, may your grace, may your wonder, may your act of history-changing surrender at the cross, which resulted in history-changing victory over sin, death, and hell. May that be impressed upon our hearts as we go into worship. As we go into a time of giving, may we understand that your grace, we sing that song as your grace is enough, but that's almost not big enough to say it, because your grace is more than enough. Your grace is overwhelming. May we realize that everything we have flows from you through the cross, through the act of Christ, through what he's done for us. And may we be a generous people who give in an overwhelming, overflowing, generous way. You're a great God. In your name, amen.
We are going into a time of responsive worship. Basically, worship is through giving. Thank you for your support during this time. For those of you online, you can give through the links below. We also have a basket in there for those of you in person. So let me take a moment to pray for the offering. Heavenly Father, you are good. We thank you for your goodness and for the grace of God in our lives. I pray for this offering. May we give generously. May we give cheerfully. May we give in response to who you are. Thank you. I love you so much. Amen. As we take a moment for the offering, please join me in reading our memory verses, which is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 20 to 21. Therefore,
we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We plead on Christ's behalf. Be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
In response to the message, let's take a moment to pray for generous and graceful hearts, for hearts that are attuned to the grace of God in our lives. So feel free to pray quietly, or if you feel led, pray aloud for the congregation. So let's take a moment to pray.
Lord, we just pray to be eager in our service to you and others, that we would
could you be so good to me?
How could you be so good to me?
How could you be so good to me?
How could you be so good to me?
Not alone, so sing along. Not alone, so sing along, sing along, sing along. Here we go. No one like you, there has never, ever been anyone like you. Ever been anyone like you. No one like you, there has never, ever been anyone like you. Dear the Father,